pray to start. Lord, help us to understand the things that are worth understanding about faith and philosophy and the things that T.F. Torrance and Karl Barth and so many have wrestled with, and help us to find clarity of thought and the reason why these are important questions so that others may see these words and not turn away, but investigate more who you are, what it means to be faithful to your people, to be receptive to all those things that you would have us take into ourselves, that we might be changed and transformed because of who you are. So do this all we pray in your name, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
So Ken, you're asking the question of whether Barth in CD1 addresses these questions. And so to say the nature of the theological project of Karl Barth is to recognize all the ways that philosophically incorrect starting points keep us from actually doing the work of theology, is to say that even if you're taking on somebody like Schleiermacher or that, you're dealing with philosophical issues that are wrong starting points for getting to a form of faith that Barth and Torrance are both wanting to have, and that is one that is engaged in the reality, where faith is formed in us because of the other, or to use Brighton's word, we become receptive to something that is other and transformed so that the imprint in our thinking is true to the nature of that which we are engaging. So at one point, Brighton talked about fields and sowers and what it means to have minds that are able to have good seed fall on them and to grow and all that. And that was, I think, some of the language of receptivity. And so the question of, what is the work that we as humans can do that makes sure that our soil has lots of good manure in it, so that when the seed falls on it, it has a fertile place to get the nutrients that are necessary to grow something. So to say that the nature of this article, in some ways, it's challenging because the nature of the place from which Barth and Torrance are working is engaging something where the world, for the most part, that Barth and Torrance worked in, had views of the nature of faith and science that were different from what were being presented. And so the fallow ground has to be turned up, revisioned as to what it is that it looks like to become receptive to the good seed that might fall on the ground. And the idea of breaking up the fallow ground that's become hard and dry and all of that might be part of the image that is there. Not to say that this article doesn't have a hardness and a dryness to it at some level. Nevertheless, you say something?
As a college student, Tom had been a philosophy. I'm trying to remember whether it was a philosophy major or a Bible major. At university, he would study theology as part of philosophy or as an adjoining discipline to philosophy, to theology, because there was a theology department at university, and I don't think he matriculated there. But this new college was also functioning as the theological faculty, a theological faculty of the university. And he had Norman Kemp Smith as a professor, who had written, he said at the time, the book on Kant, and that Torrance had devoured Kant, and that Karl Barth, 30 years before, when he finally got to university, the first thing he did is he started reading Kant, the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason and religion within the boundaries of reason itself. That kind of philosophy. And he even cites Kemp Smith in the early pages of this article. Is pretty well settling the argument once and for all. This is what theology is and how it works, or this is what faith is and how it works as a human capacity. This is what philosophy does. There are some built-in problems to all philosophies that they cannot escape from. And so we have to, at some point in here, when he uses Kierkegaard, uh, as we were remarking before, that here's someone in the later Torrance does not quote anymore, and Bard never found much time for. I am curious where he learned Kierkegaard, because I don't know if it was being taught at Edinburgh. Did he have to read it at Princeton, for example, or wherever they could get good English translations? When he finds his theology of crisis in philosophy, the crisis in philosophy that can only be resolved by a leap of faith. This is very typical early 20th century theological criticism of philosophy. And I wish he had more footnotes. I'd like to know where he got this stuff.
Yes.
But by the time he's writing this, there's almost no quotes. There's no footnotes. He's assuming the authority he already owns to say that philosophy by itself is a dead end. You must have faith in order for philosophy to be an actual, real human science that deals with pain, evil, the disasters that the human flesh is prone to, all of that stuff. You're not a serious philosopher until you deal with that, and that
maybe he got it from McMurray.
McMurray was not big in Kierkegaard. He dealt more with Aristotle and some others, but yeah, I don't see Kierkegaard much. Brighton, what you got for us?
The thing I find interesting, Ken, though, is that Torrance makes it clear that the philosopher does have faith. It's just a case of what their faith is pinned in,
yeah,
and do they understand what it is that their premise of faith is?
Yeah.
Can they articulate it?
Yeah.
And I think, once you actually really probe that assumption of Torrance's, which I think is correct, the whole dilemma of faith and reason and faith takes on a very different perspective, because humans never, ever, in my book, lose faith. It's ever only a discussion about whence that faith, its objects of faith, the goals of that faith, etc., etc., etc.
Right.
And I think that's in the end how I parse his very dense prose. I mean, like you, I was really gasping for oxygen often, because it's staggering stuff. I mean, and I'm quite used to difficult stuff, and I'm going, oh, please, mate. Anyway, there we go. I think once you see the horns of the dilemma are actually false, then you make progress.
Yeah.
At least that's where, as far as I've got. It's taken me a few decades, 55, 60 years, I don't know, to get where I've got to intellectually. But I love this article once I think I vaguely maybe understood it. And I'm going, hallelujah, Torrance. But hey, mate, could you repackage this, please? Could you actually preach a sermon that's evangelistic to the Western mind and heart, so that these dear, lovely people you were talking about earlier can actually understand this boy?
That's what he spent the rest of his life doing, maybe, is trying to revise and repackage what it is he's saying here.
Yep.
So just to throw a bit of fuel on the fire, the title is Faith and Philosophy. And so to say, it could be that faith is generally held out as something that people are supposed to have without a particular reason. It is seen often as simply something that one decides to have without evidence. And so he's obviously going to flip that and say, well, that's not actually faith at all. Faith has to actually be grounded in the nature of the reality that one encounters. And it becomes then that responsive, and we might even use your word receptive, sense that we are taught by reality, and that which we are taught we call faith, right? And then from there, we can keep investigating. And I think with the word philosophy, he's going to begin by arguing that we think of philosophy as something that is human wisdom to really understand the world. But he's going to say, hang on a second. We've got these philosophers, they're stuck up in this tower of their brains, observing what's going on down below, detached from it, in a sense, just reflecting on the pictures on the walls, and they're not actually gauging reality. So philosophy has lost touch with reality. Faith is actually the very thing of engaging reality. So we need to flip what it is that each of them is and see that once you get faith in an appropriate upfront position, then the nature of the tools of philosophy that you might use to understand what's there becomes faith seeking understanding. And the word understanding would be equivalent of philosophy then. But now it's become tools of investigation instead of the presuppositions of what can be known from within the head, observing something that is out there somewhere. Transcendental unity of apperception, the place from which you then categorize the world and see things because you've got it all already in your head. So I think just to look at the title, and as you said, he's starting in a sense with the horns of a dilemma, that we've just got these words backwards, and therefore neither of them is being used appropriately to understand anything.
Yeah.
How's that for just, there's actually 3 words in the title, so that's an unpacking of the 3 words, the title. And so the problem is we need to serve the contemporary conversation around faith to reassert what it is that's actually grounded in reality, and then gives us the basis upon which to understand the nature of God, the world, and ourselves. And we need to re-understand philosophy not as a human endeavor to see how things fit within the boxes that we put things into, but to become the curiosity of a child, the investigative processes where humans delve into an understanding of something that is given and is there for us. And that, as he saw it, the philosophers he's going to start out with are pretty much those who have taken us in the wrong direction, until you get to who? John McMurray.
Yeah.
McMurray is going to be the one who flips the switch for him in this article. And again, this is the first mention in any of T.F. Torrance's writings of John McMurray. What he is quoting from had been written quite a bit earlier, so it wasn't something that McMurray had just written. So the argument as to, when Torrance would have read it, we don't know exactly when he read it. He didn't footnote it here, but it had been, I think it was 1935, the book that he was quoting from. So here we are on 49. So he'd been reading McMurray and was aware of the works that's here, and it was, I think, influencing his thinking. Bill, what you got?
Well, I was just wondering, you mentioned in your essay in the Scottish Journal,
Yeah,
the influence of McMurray. You said that the first positive mention in your footnote of McMurray was contained in the bibliography in Alistair McGrath's intellectual biography. I'm just wondering, why do you think, or do you know, why McGrath never mentioned the influence of McMurray?
that is such a good question. Such a good
You
question.
better ask him.
And
Yeah, well,
again,
you ask him. He's your buddy.
he's your man. Yeah, when I go back to work with Carrie in March, I will be doing some of the foundational work for an essay that I'll be doing for Participatio, which is more specific than the Scottish Journal of Theology article on the general influence of McMurray on Torrance, and asking specifically the influence of his scientific thinking on Torrance. And what we're looking at in this article today is clearly one of the pieces of the puzzle, chart that out. But for Alistair to have not included McMurray is mind-boggling to me at some level. Even in the Christian frame of mind, the phrase, my 2 senior mentors, John McMurray and Michael Polanyi, to say this, that for somebody to talk about senior mentors in a book, The Christian Frame of Mind, just seems like there should be an acknowledgement, something in the mentoring world, how we, use phrases and the progression of thought should have been something that was included. So I have not, of course, talked to Alistair, but it is certainly something that's amazing is missing. Yes, Bryden.
I will send him an email precisely quoting this article.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about this article, and I assume, Marty, you're right, that this is the first evidence of Torrance's quoting John McMurray.
But he qualifies that. He says positive.
There's a mention that he has, I can't remember where it is, where he's concerned about the humanism of McMurray earlier on. He was aware of McMurray, but felt that that McMurray was starting with basically a humanist point of view that would have put him into the critique that he has of these other people. But at this point, he switches and he never looks back. He never criticizes McMurray again. He simply employs his language, his methodology, and ultimately the whole sense of the nature of the person. McMurray is really the person he pursues. And again, in the end of that letter that Torrance wrote in support of McMurray's being knighted, he says that McMurray is the one who has the greatest hope of really bringing to the social sciences what has happened to the natural sciences. No one else has come close except maybe Michael Polanyi. Right. So, I mean, when somebody puts Michael Polanyi behind somebody in Torrance's, then you just go, okay, we got to pay attention here. There's something that is needing to be profoundly affirmed. And again, Polanyi was asked to write, also like Torrance was asked to write a letter in support. So I have the letter that that Polanyi's wife wrote saying, I'm sorry, but Michael is too sick at this point to do it. They both died in 1976 at the same time. So both of them were on their deathbeds basically. And so he wasn't able to do it, but that he was asked, and that his wife wrote back in response to Barnes, who was collecting these, means that there was an awareness and respect also with Polanyi that McMurray was somebody to be paid attention to and worthy of a letter. So again, all of this to say
although can I just interject, Marty?
Yeah.
I find it interesting that if this is the first place here, 243, immediately 244, he actually goes on to talk about Buber. Yes. And I think that is in fact the driving force for much in the article, because of this extraordinary word possession. And I think possession is a helpful word because Eberhard Jungel uses it massively in his own subsequent, Gott als Geheimnis, God is the mystery of the world stuff, where love dispossesses itself and the dialectic of possession and dispossession and all that stuff with the crucified one. Yeah. And I think that what you have is Buber's sensibilities begin to shroud out McMurray's at this point in this article. I think that's the flow. I'm not sure, but what do others think? I mean, they've read the article.
The one thing I will point out is that in the introduction to Martin Buber's I and Thou, he makes this comment: I am the poet of personalism. John McMurray is the philosopher.
Ah!
That's Martin Buber.
Wow.
So, I mean, to recognize Buber did great things through what one might call very poetic language.
Yep.
But there's something about the nature of what McMurray did that wasn't competing in a sense, though I think there are some things that McMurray was better on than Buber, but they weren't in conflict with one another. And I think they were aware of each other enough that there would be ideas that would overlap. So the question of possession and what that means, if that's a distinctive between McMurray and Buber, I don't know that I have enough of Buber's understanding of possession to know what the distinctive would be.
And I immediately flipped on to Eberhard Jungel because of the way he uses that phrase. And I don't know enough about Buber either.
When was Buber available?
Well, I mean,
this essay
first,
is based on what he knew when he got out of the army and got back to the parish. So he's pulling up his textbooks from the 1930s and reading them. He's got if Barth had been quoting Buber in Church Dogmatics 1, then that's where he may have read him in German.
Yeah.
But
3.2 is where Buber really shows up. 3.2 is
uh,
where he really shows up, though.
Where?
3.2 is where Buber
3.2.
really comes in. Yeah.
That's a decade later.
Yeah.
I think
the
too,
two heroes here are Kierkegaard and Buber, and a waves to Dilthey in passing, but he says that Kant boxed us in, and it took the modern philosophy post-Kantian to break this open and get us out of that box. There's there's only that whiff of John McMurray there. You could have gotten that from a book review. It doesn't.
Just to stay a little bit beyond a whiff, there are places where he's not quoting McMurray, but on page 240, the Hebrew Christian, that's McMurray. He doesn't give McMurray credit there. And then when he does quote McMurray on 243, so that reason is described as the capacity to behave consciously in terms of the nature of the object. Reason is our capacity for objectivity. The next sentence, that is the point at which we can begin to understand Christian faith.
Yep.
I take that as not a small leap, that there's something about the nature of what he's doing there that becomes a foundation for the whole nature of what flows from it, and what several authors have pointed out as the key axiom of Torrance's work is that sentence right there.
Yep.
And so I'd say it's a short sentence, but it's not a whiff. It's a punctuation mark that resonates through all of Torrance's work.
Although interestingly, Buber pops up not just on 244 and the rest, as Ken's pointing out, in God and Rationality. He goes back to Buber and his whole eclipse of God language.
Yeah.
And what that does to our very language itself, because there's no paradigm, there's no landing point for all our metaphors and symbols and all the rest of the rubbish.
Yeah.
Which I think is...
Don't want to diminish Buber. I think that Torrance has a chorus of voices, and he allows them to step up to the mic and do their bit, and then he builds on it.
Karaoke, yes.
So I don't know that there's necessarily a pushing out of the way, other than his opening paragraphs are people who he introduces as supporting something that builds on a Kantian, Schleiermachian, it's built on human perceptions, and therefore is problematic. That there's a sense in which he's putting forward some people to the mic to let them show themselves incompetent to give us what we need to have true faith, and not just a faith that is constructed in our minds.
Well, it's faith in faith, isn't it, Marty?
Well, in a sense, it is that, but it's the whole it's the inward turn that our philosophy is merely a tracing of that inward world, thinking about thinking and building on that. So just reading the first little short introductory paragraph, it is the aim of this article, so it does have an aim, to maintain the view that it is only by means of faith, and so we have to define faith, that philosophy can be kept true to itself. So that means that philosophy has a capacity to wander, get lost, and only faith can reground it in reality, is how I would read that. Philosophy, by its very nature, is always on the road to a dogmatic philosophy, so we have to ask what that means, which insists on contemplating a unitary interpretation of reality. Think generalizing everything. Nature always does this, men always do this, women always do this. It's the alwaysness of that unitary interpretation of trying to make the world fit within probably an Aristotelian category kind of thing. Will inevitably override and falsify the facts of existence. So the brain reading reality will ultimately not be true to reality and will get lost in the forest of our brain. In this way,
Because
philosophy
it
may
cannot,
betray itself. Well, go ahead.
says that because it cannot account for evil.
Yeah.
And
That's
for that,
that is going to be one of his points. Yeah.
a main point that it's
Yeah.
the humanism, what do you call it? The basic optimism of most unitary approaches that are not corrected by a really critical philosophy or a theology that would insist that evil must be taken into account, or your philosophy is worthless. And the was going to he's using Weltanschauung, whereas later he will drop that and talk about the scientific perspective on reality.
As a worldview, kind of.
Yeah, because he's dealing mostly with philosophers. You know, there's none of the allusion to what Einstein had been doing. There's no allusion. He has not yet read Polanyi. He has never encountered him. He's using the much more philosophically based criticisms of pre-Kantian philosophy. He read Hume at Edinburgh and he read Kant at Edinburgh. And it's when he moved from the philosophy faculty to the theology faculty, I bet the first thing the theology faculty wants him to do is account for the problem of evil. Otherwise, what are you doing in the theology faculty at all? And don't think about, I mean, how do you explain the cross? What is redemption? All the great things he alludes to. So this is sort of his finishing paper of something that he would hand to any student going off to college to say, don't be enamored of philosophy if you think philosophy can explain everything. Even philosophers now say philosophy cannot explain everything and still be a philosophy. It has become a naive faith. And you're not being honest about that. If Dilthey was already saying that, no, everybody's in that school. If they're going to be doing serious critical philosophy now, it's going to have to be one that can explain the reasonableness of a faith as a stance towards reality that embraces the reality of the reality as objectively beyond the self. And that all of the Hegelian and other earlier philosophies just lacked that critical corrective. And he's just on the basis of his philosophical training, he's saying why I have to be a theologian. I can't simply be a philosopher. And in that, I wonder if there's something of that tension between Karl Barth and Heinrich Barth. His brother never understood why everybody was so gaga about his kid brother.
Go ahead, Bryden.
You raise the question of evil, and I mean, he does raise it. I mean, for him, it's the real thorn in the flesh of the philosopher. He then goes on to talk about medieval philosophies. Now, I think session today, Marty.
Bit, Bryden.
But I mean, perspectives on evil. Oh, are you there? No, sorry.
We lost part of your sentences there. So
okay, well, let me go back. I don't know if you want us to pursue the nature of evil, privation or parasitic or yin and yang or dualistic or whatever, because I think having recognized with Torrance that philosophy has to not just accommodate evil, but say, hey, we need to acknowledge its reality. Well, what is its reality is my question quite quickly,
Mm.
because I do remember that a certain person called Saint Paul wants us to be little children when it comes to sin and evil, but in understanding, be adult, be mature. And of course, what he means by that is understand who Jesus is. And I remember my New Testament lecturer, a fellow called Arthur Moore, who studied under Barth himself, that he was a little loath to go too far into the ponds of fishing, you might call them, called sin, or the pond of fishing called evil. And I think I've carried that with me because I think it's quite wise. There are things about these powers, if you want to call them that, and certainly Paul sees sin as a power, an alien power, that should make us slightly cautious. So that, I don't know if you know Evil and Modern Thought by Susan Neiman, a very interesting rewriting in her mind of the history of modern philosophy. And I do think it's quite a helpful book. Tom Wright obviously has read it and uses it, blah, blah, blah. I'll post the bibliographical details if you want. But I don't think she goes nowhere because she's a secular Jewess and she's got no answer for the Shoah. She doesn't. She has no answer for the Shoah. And I mean, who has an answer for the Shoah? Well, there you go, you see. Anyway, that's enough from me about maybe you want to go down this road today. I don't know. But it does kind of beg the question, seeing as Torrance raises it as the thorn in the flesh, the conundrum for philosophy. And Ken's right. It sticks out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Incrementally, his next challenge will be to prove the scientific soundness of theological thinking. They are both forms of rationality, but he's not there yet. He will find eventually in the great scientists, and I think it's touched on in that book on Einstein that we read about a year ago, that the one thing that confounded most of the theoretical physicists was they trying to account for why is there something when there should be nothing, and other big issues, and that it cannot be based on experimentation, and it cannot be derived from nature. We have to ask those kinds of questions and then question those questions. His questioning the questions line is in here, and he says he gets it. He says he gets it from Kant, and that I can believe that, and I think Kant was Torrance's major philosopher, with all of his limitations, very much acknowledged and pointed to. That I doubt it. He would never swallow it or correct it, but he certainly knows that Kant was still the philosopher of the late 19th and early 20th century, especially for people interested in science or the relationship between science and religion, or people who were trying to homogenize Schleiermacher with Christianity. How do you deal with these basic philosophical questions?
Well, to be critical is to be a philosopher.
Mm.
Oh, you're so critical, Brian.
No, I'm a cynic. Sorry, mate.
So to say this article is largely about epistemology. We're asking about the questions of faith and philosophy as epistemological. How are we going to get to reality? And as you're pointing out with evil, the question of how do we get something of the reality of evil, either in the language of traditional philosophy or faith, in some way that actually corresponds to reality. Evil is going to be one of the questions, but there are others that certainly will be raised as well.
Yeah. This section on unity and coherence is saying that all the philosophers he respects are trying to deal with these problems of unity and coherence, because even I've got a couple of anthropologists who deal with evil as an anthropological question, because it assaults human nature at a fundamental level that all cultures feel and respond to. So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can't really scientifically be an anthropologist if you cannot resonate with that and begin to inquire after it and be guided in what kind of answers are helpful answers.
Mhm. But at some
Well,
level, we can't begin with the problem of evil any more than, unfortunately, modern psychology begins with disorders and calls it mental health.
Hmm.
When really all they do is describe the nature of the evils that befall humans with bipolar and narcissistic and other diagnosed disorders that fall within the nature of the human not being something that one might call healthy mentally. But if you ask pretty much anybody, what is the definition that everyone agrees on in mental health, what we mean by health, it's not there.
Hmm.
And
no,
so to
no.
say that the nature of the work that I think that Torrance does and Bart is that they actually do point the way where you can actually identify something of health, but it's going to be defined Christologically. And the use of the word faith is not going to be just a, well, I hope it works out, or I
No.
think this might be, and it's actually grounded in the objectivity of the particularity of the person of Christ, who deals with evil and all those things, but who deals with it as one who has a sense of what it means to be truly human, loving God, loving neighbor, loving self in the fullest expression of those, so that we can say, that's what it looks like for a human being to function in a way that the word health becomes appropriate for them. So there is a theological grounding that's being pointed to here. Torrance never developed particularly the full sense of the mental health question, but I think he does lay the tracks towards it and thinks that the physical sciences have laid tracks in the right direction, but it's still a track that needs to be engaged. And in McMurray's critique in the beginning of The Selfish Agent of Kant, the Romantics, it's the point that is being made here in this next section of the problem with philosophy that ends up being a cul-de-sac in the brain.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm just going to go back to this. There's a few more sentences in the first. I've almost made it through the first paragraph, so I like to capture the best as I can get in. In this way, philosophy will betray itself. It is here that Christian faith, not just any faith, but Christian faith can play a very important part in helping philosophy to be more critical of itself. So he sees faith helping philosophy to do something that validates philosophy, but not on its own terms. On the other hand, a truly critical philosophy can play a very great part in helping faith to be reflective. And so here he opens a door to say thoughtful minds are good. We need Polanyi's, we need Einstein's, we need people who have the skills to see things that otherwise wouldn't be seen. And so, I take that as a very helpful opening door that I think Bart has more than people kind of acknowledge when he rejects natural theology. He doesn't reject the natural sciences when done appropriately. And even psychology, he talks about points at which it's helpful to have those tools. And I think it's the acknowledgement here. There are things that we do when we study the Christian God that create the very foundation of how we know what we know. And then we have a lot of language, which all language is philosophy at some level, right? And so we just have to admit, if you're using language, you're philosophizing, you're describing, you're pointing towards reality, but it isn't the reality. And so here, this acknowledgement, there is this possibility of a helping relationship, a helping of reflective faith to be more faithful. Now, the phrase reflective faith to be more faithful, the selfish agent begins with the argument, we as humans are not I think, therefore I am, but we are I act, therefore I am. And because I act, I can reflect on that. That's the argument also of interpreting the universe. And so to say, even in this opening thing, though it doesn't quote McMurray, he is working with McMurray's Christian vision because McMurray concluded this based on understanding of Christian theology, which he was a significant Christian before he ever became a philosopher. So to say he's already flipping the script in this opening statement to say there is something that should not be at odds with one another, but there's an appropriate ordering of faith that allows for philosophy to do its work. And when philosophy understands it work, it's going to help us to do what we do better.
Mhm.
So it's a non-competitive collaboration in exploring the nature of reality, and particularly the nature of God and our human receptivity in the world that God has made. You like that, Braden?
Can I chip in with another interlocutor, as it were? I mean,
Yes,
Bernard Lonergan, I've mentioned him before on this
yes.
thread. His GEM, his general empirical method, experience, understanding, evaluation, action, judgment, and then it goes on up right through to love. It's a it's a transcendental method in one sense, but he's far more than just that. He was a polymath, a Canadian polymath, died in 1984. I think what he's doing is very, very similar to what you've just done, because his judgment is an action. It precipitates further experiences which need further evaluation, which precipitate further action. Judgment and action are integral, and I love it because here he is, one of the finest brains on the planet, Bernard Lonergan, I believe, giving us very simple tools to actually do what's going on in this paper as well. Just the language is different, the grammar is slightly different, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I got to the end of it. Yes, it took a while, Ken. You're absolutely right. I mean, goodness me, the false starts and cul-de-sacs I found myself in was a bit worrying. You know, maybe it was the time of day, but it is interesting that so many people in the last, well, century perhaps, are actually ploughing a very similar furrow.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that very exciting.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I really do. It's terribly exciting.
There's a book called Guides for the Journey that engages both Lonergan and McMurray. There's a few others in there, but it is seen. There are those who have seen what it is that you're saying, that there are ways to
Yep.
recognize the ground that is being pointed in the same direction in their own unique language and all that. So yeah.
Could you please flick that bibliographical detail as well on, I mean, not now, but on your thread.
Okay. I will
I mean,
attempt. Yeah, up just during the weeks where you're saying.
yeah. I mean,
Some-
what I find fascinating is that it's almost as if God's providence is saying, "Okay, guys, I think you need a helping hand here," and He gives us these polymaths and these interdisciplinary engagements, and little by little by little, there is a real body of stuff here. The trick, of course, is to kind of, I will go back, Ken, to your parish church. It's all very well admiring his intellect, but hang on, he's actually got to cash it out on a Wednesday night in the pub, or on the Thursday morning in the boardroom, or on the Friday morning in the janitor's office.
Yeah. That's probably why he got out of the parish.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's McGrath who says he was going to evangelize, but it was not going to be street evangelism with the kids. It was going to be evangelizing the universities by critiquing with tools the universities would recognize as valid, with names and footnotes and all the apparatus of critical thinking to show that he's grounded in the history of philosophy, and he's grounded in the debates, internal debates of philosophy, and he is able to make certain broad points, which he puts under these all caps headings, expecting that once he's made those points, everybody will say, well, okay, I see what you're saying, and as far as I'm concerned, you've made your point. Built on is bigger than a philosophy, and then all the problems that Einstein was having in physics. How do you describe the fundamental components of reality without the language to do it? He had to do it with mathematics, and it took him years. And he found plenty of other scientists having the same problem when they were dealing with, how do I know what I'm doing here is connected to the reality that's out there? When every time I try to express that, it collapses around me, and it doesn't make sense. But I get enough of an encouragement each time I do it that I keep coming back to it. That's this may be the last essay he does before he makes the leap to be using scientists to explain how rationality works in science in order to find analogies really that he had already hoped would exist for talking about critical philosophy.
Mm, mm.
This is where it'll be nice to get Simon back to answer some of those questions of some of the other people he saw as early influences on that scientific thinking.
Yeah. He wrote a intellectual biography when he was old, and he his theological lectures at Auburn Seminary. He talked this way to his poor students at Auburn. I have no access to those documents, so I can't make.
I am working with Kerry Magruder on getting the ability to post them. He has the document, but he has to get permissions
from the family.
And once I get that from Princeton, to be able to post it so that we're able to read that. But anyway, I have been working on it with Kerry, and he seems optimistic that it can happen, but doesn't want to push the Princeton people in ways that creates resistance. It's like, okay, fine.
Yeah. Once it's out, and they lose intellectual control. They can't.
But it seems like getting it out is a good thing. I mean, sometimes it's like, so why are you hiding the slide into the bushel? You're supposed to get it out.
Yeah. But when there's somebody running along behind you, and every time you turn around, he takes one page out of the document. Says, no, he never wrote that. This is how things get falsified. Archivists really, and I was an archivist for 16 years, is trying to make sure that when the document gets out, it cannot be added to or subtracted from, and so it has its own integrity. Then people can quote it with confidence. But anything
we're working on.
Well, that's the point why they're being fussy.
Yeah, but there is a lot of work to be done to trace the roots of some of these thoughts. And it's to help us to become better able to use the tools of what it is that Torrance is trying to develop for service, the life of the church, and thinking, and all that. And I think we're in desperate times for needing that kind of thoughtful, careful engagement.
I think very much if we can understand the building blocks of things, then we actually can really begin to understand what it is they're really saying. And I do think that's quite an important place to take students, because for me, whenever I try and lecture, I say, now look, I'm here for really one purpose only, and that is by the end of this semester or whatever it is, the unit or whatever it is, you're going to be reformulating the questions that bring you to this unit in the first place. Because it's wonderful that you're here, but what you're asking now is woefully inadequate, in fact, pertaining to the subject that's before us. I mean, that's the kind of language I use in my very first talks, lectures, whatever they are. And they kind of go, oh, really? Yes, actually, really. You know, I had a wonderful experience, if I can just put it bluntly. He was a graduate of a small internship that I'm involved in. And he's 20 years of age, bless his tiny cotton socks. And I happened to be sitting next to him. No, it was entirely set up for this dinner. And we get chatting, you know, who are you, and what are you doing, and how are you here, and blah, 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 all this kind of lovely social mapping of the evening and so on. Anyway, it transpires that he's as just described. So I said, oh, well, you know, the interesting thing is you'll be questioning what you've learned until you're my age. Really? He says. You mean you're continuing to question? I said, yes, I'm still alive, you know. And this look of horror comes over this 20-year-old, you know, as if to say, you mean there are no answers? No, that's not what I said. That's not what I said. And he looks at me and he says, oh, well, where do we begin now, you see? So he's caught between this thing about answers and questions. And I'm going, okay, brother, where do you want to go by the time you're 30? So that's how I brought it down to earth for him.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was this panic on his face and everything and everything. I thought, okay, this is great. This is great.
And these days, just inspiring curiosity is the hard thing to do, much less going to the point of wanting answers. So,
Mm.
and
Oh,
that's
he was a smart boy, but a
yeah,
beautiful, beautiful, fresh person,
yeah. Good. So, I mean, in light of that, to say the nature of this article, to present it to the kind of people who you're talking about, to say, this word faith, we think it's something that's kind of abstract and out there that you believe without proof. Faith might just be engaging reality set in such a way that you can say something about it and keep learning about it. And philosophy is a human investigation that uses the tools of recognizing patterns in the way that the universe is, the way people think, and being able to articulate them so you can see what was otherwise not obvious to you. And so, in all of this, we're finding the tools to be fully human, engaging reality as we find it, and to keep on learning in the process. And I think that is the purpose of what this article is trying to do for us. You saw I posted up the book there, the Guides for the Journey. James Fowler is the third one. Significant in education and the
Oh,
development of the human.
Oh, Fowler. Oh,
stages of faith.
Stages of
yeah,
faith. Yeah,
yeah,
Yeah.
that man.
Mm.
yeah. So
Okay.
anyway, that's something for you to peruse. Guides for the Journey, John McMurray. The M is not supposed to be capitalized. The second one, McMurray specifically wanted it lower, but Bernard Lonergan and James Fowler by David G. Kramer, for those of you who don't have access to it later on. So anyway, that's something to pursue that conversation.
One of the things that Alistair comments on, McGrath, is that when Torrance was in Aberdeen, he linked up with the theological, philosophical faculties at Aberdeen. That's a possible another source for. I mean, if they sit around scuttlebutting about this stuff, I'm sure as soon as he got there, he organized a group of people to meet once a month and present papers to each other, because it's just what the kind of thing that you do. So Aberdeen is something in there, and I would be very interested in seeing when certain things like Buber and editions of Kierkegaard were generally available in either in Edinburgh or in Aberdeen, so he would have access to them. His founding journals also at this time, I thought it rather curious that he didn't hold this journal article to print in his own journal. Instead, he went to a very old, traditional philosophical theological journal, the Hibbert journal. I mean, this is like 49 years was being published in 1949. So venerable place to get his ideas out there, and I suspect also indexed so people could find them.
That's good to know. I wouldn't have known that about the nature of character. I've never heard of this journal, so to hear that would be the case is certainly valuable.
It's the kind of thing that the late Victorian gentlemen would have gotten together to publish.
Yeah.
Religion and philosophy.
Good. So just pressing on to the second paragraph. In the section entitled Philosophy and Weltanschauung, which is worldview, which I had a conversation once with a high schooler who was being homeschooled and talked about that she was being taught a Christian worldview, which would be the world here. And the nature of how that worldview was played out as a homeschooler is what people would generally say is quite narrow. So most of science and all that was called into question. So just because one has a worldview doesn't mean that it's not got a very narrow perspective from which one looks to see the world and excludes many things that are not considered to be something that should be considered. And science is one of those things within this particular homeschool community that shouldn't be covered. So anyway, you can just see that the word has a sound as though it's going to look at the whole world, hence the concern for the unity that he talks about, the unitary interpretation, that
Mhm.
worldviews tend to be selective and create a narrowness that doesn't allow you to be as wholesome as one might hope for. In the end, Torrance is going to always talk about the nature of the unitary sense of the universe, that is taken as a whole and not merely broken up into parts, and that Einstein with relativity is doing that, and the McMurray did that as well. So to just recognize the problems with using words like unitary and taking it in its wholeness and all that, you have to be very careful that you're not using the word unitary, but meaning narrow within how I see the world. And that's what he's critiquing as we open up this section. So this famous dictum by Dilthey to the effect there is no partial thought, no impartial thought, excuse me. So if it's not
Right.
impartial, that means it's always going to be partial, selective. I see this and not that. So if somebody says, I'm a scientist, you may say, well, what kind of science do you do? Well, I'm an astronomer. So how are you with medicine? Don't touch it except for the doctors that take care of me, right? So to say there is a grand partiality in the sciences to focus on a particular aspect of the natural world as we find it. And Torrance is quoting this to say that there is this natural sensibility for a partial look at things that can be very misleading, and especially if what it is that you do is begin with abstract thinking. In other words, you don't get out of your head to even discover the world. If your philosophy begins in the head and ends in the head, which Descartes' I think, therefore I am, is not radically different from Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. I have thoughts in my head and I categorize the world based on the thoughts in my head, that it's trying to fit the world within the boxes that are resident in the storage spaces in your head. They still all leave you basically in your head. So his critiquing here, they come from something much deeper, a certain habit or set of mind, which gives these arguments their real force. So habits of mind, mindsets, these are all part of the language he's introducing here. Science and metaphysics, therefore, are not pursued in any real detachment from a worldview or elemental orientation of mind, for they cannot escape the fundamental attitude of the thinker himself. So there is the captured mind with preset fences that are in place that don't allow one to do an exploration of the real world, only that which is contained in the mind. And so the critiques of Dilthey will be that he really adopted much from Schleiermacher, that the sensibilities of the human mind, the dependence on the other, was the human sense of something that then pursues from that sensibility and doesn't really engage the nature of the real world. So to recognize partiality doesn't mean that he's agreeing in every sense with what it is that follows from here. The idea of not able to escape from the fundamental attitude of the thinker himself is once again one of McMurray's concepts, the apperceptions, the place from which one thinks to see the world. And this is where McMurray outlines the nature of Roman, Hebrew, and Greek based on the human sense of how one looks at the world around the emotion of fear. McMurray says if you have fear, fight and flight are the two common apperceptions. That if you flight means I don't want to deal with this, I'm out of here. And so to withdraw can be into your room, into your head, or into an idealistic philosophy where you don't have to engage with whatever the fear is about. The nature of fight is I'm going to take this on, and it may be with fists, it may be with building walls or bridges. And so he identifies Rome as a culture that was based on fight, the fight apperception, and that even today, the Western world is Roman at heart. It asks, how can I control the world? What systems and structures can I put in place to manage all those things that could go wrong? And he suggests, this is McMurray, that when Christianity met Roman culture, we ended up with Roman Catholicism, a highly controlling, dealing with the nature of the fear of the world if things get out of hand, that creates structures of law, hierarchy, and all those things, so that it takes on really the form of an apperception, or a place from which to think about organizing everything in Christianity around the need to control. And with Greek, which is a withdrawing into the head, into the world of philosophy, of internal thinking, that when the Greek culture met Christianity, you got Greek orthodoxy, a form of Christianity of transcending the world through icon, through worships that take us into the eschatological aspect, which Zuzoulis describes as is all of that which is present, but up there, and all churches participate in the eternal. And so once again, it's a withdrawing from the world through all of the signs, symbols, and forms of worship that gives one something that deals with the fear of this world by transcending it. And so those are apperceptions that McMurray was already talking about. And at some level, the language that he's using here is pointing already in that kind of direction. He develops it in particularly The Clue to History, which was 1939 that book came out from McMurray. So it had been out for a while that is there. And later on, he's going to talk about the Hebrew Christian apperception. Basically, he doesn't use the word apperception there, but that was the positive, a view of life that is based in love, and identifying the Hebrew culture as identified with that which God, Yahweh, makes of Israel. It wasn't because of a land or anything that they were a people like Rome and Greece. It was because of a particular personal relationship with the God who loved and covenanted. And so the basis of its cultural apperception was identity in personal relationship. And so the nature of what is being built here by Torrance is already beginning to recognize cultural apperceptions, as has been outlined by McMurray. And he's referencing some without talking about McMurray, but it's still, I think, in his blood at some level. Did you want to say something, Bryden?
If I may quote Robert Jensen, who does a McMurray in a slightly different guise,
Sure.
given the drum that Jensen wants to beat, which
Yes.
is futurity, if I may.
Yes.
Gods, whose identity lies in the persistence of a beginning, are cultivated because in them we are secure against the threatening future. The gods of the nations are guarantors of continuity and return, and he underlines and emphasizes both those words, against the daily threat to fragile established order. Indeed, they are continuity and return. The Lord's meaning for Israel is the opposite. The archetypically established order of Egypt was the very damnation from which the Lord released her into being, and what she thereby entered was the insecurity of the desert. Her God is not salvific because he defends against the future, but because he poses it. Now, for me, that's one of the seminal purple passages of volume 1 of his systematic theology. And I mean, there's another purple passage in volume 2, the works of God. And I think, again, you've got a waltzing movement of McMurray and Robert Jensen at this point. They're going round and round the ballroom. And it's absolutely beautiful to behold the complementarity and the music that they're creating. And Robert Jensen will use the metaphor of music profoundly in his work. And I do want to toss that into this subject as well, because faith is always, in the Christian sense, faith in the future that God has promised in the past will be fulfilled for the future. And it's this extraordinary dynamic that history is being generated by. And I mean, you know, whether it's your little history, Marty, or mine, or the world's history. It's very, very lovely. Very lovely.
So
it did.
this is all very life engagement stuff that we're wrestling with how Torrance and these others are wrestling with
Yeah.
what's the task of the human in
Yep.
recognizing there is reality and there are apperceptions or engagement of it that
Yep.
bring lenses and all that, and how we dance out of the future, the security of the future. All these things come into play.
Yep.
So,
Sorry, Ken.
and
I mean,
McMurray actually took some courses in geology. A lot of McMurray's thought came out of the work of the scientific tools that were used in the investigation of geology to understand the nature of reality and to create an understanding of the story and the formation and all that from it. So that was around 1919 that he took that course. So it's early in McMurray's thought that science became important as a methodological lens through which to understand the world. And I think, again, the nature of just this first section on page 237, 38, and
Yeah.
on to 39 and even 40, it's all basically a critique of philosophy losing touch with reality and just working out of the resources that one creates in one's head based on somebody else's work in their head, based on somebody else's work in their head, and not really engaging reality. So the whole point of his opening sections is examples of those who use, whether it's called natural disposition or conscience or whatever, they're all people whose lenses are shaped in their head, not by engagement with reality. And so he's going to find that problematic. And even the medieval philosophers, he's going to see something that is problematic there, building on a philosophy that I think Gunton and others have seen going back through Thomas back to Aristotle and the Greek philosophers again, and the nature of how one categorizes the world in ways that are shaped quite profoundly by what goes on in the head and not as much by an ability to investigate the world. Though it's better than Plato, where the realm of ideas is reality. For Aristotle, at least, the world has a reality to it, but it doesn't have the sense of what Torrance and Polanyi and others have really investigating the world in the way that develops out of it. There was still a Greek idealism even in Aristotle. So the nature of, again, this whole section is just showing the problematic sense when philosophy works in the head, the laboratory of the head instead of the laboratory of the world.
The classic Enlightenment critique of all religion is that it's subjective and we wish to be objective. And they, by badly defining both of those terms, muddled everything up. And this whole area here, I find it fascinating that he recruits David Hume as one of his allies. And it's a very Scottish thing to do. And there's a statue of David Hume on the Royal Mile right next to St. Giles, and you would have to pass it every morning while heading off to New College to study philosophy, especially if you're trying to decantonize your philosophy to make more room for religion. Is what I think they were all doing. I see here that it's the same Scottish teacher, Kemp Smith, who wrote a book on Hume, and also then wrote a book on Kant. So that Torrance was in his class. They studied Kant. He studied Kant under.
Yep.
I just had the name, but
Kemp.
But he probably also read Hume if he hadn't read him before.
When Hume uses the word reflective judgment, is that reflecting on the world or is that reflecting on reflection?
It means judgment in. Sorry, I'm looking for the right word. When you've had time to think about it for a while, you've
evaluative sense.
Yeah, so that you've eliminated several major errors and you've narrowed it down to what you really want to talk about, and that's what when you write it, that's reflective.
Yeah, McMurray uses the idea of reflection as you act as like, wow, that was a wall there, it wasn't a door. I won't go there again. I'm going to go through the door instead of that. That's the reflection on reality that shapes us in a sense. So the word reflective can be used either in this detached way or a very engaged kind of way.
For Tom's purposes. All he needs Hume to do is to demonstrate that at the end of the Enlightenment, and a lot of people will say Hume pretty well stopped that whole line of intellectual development, and they leapt into Romanticism after that. Hume, was being very, very critical, points out that science and philosophy cannot justify its rationality from its own premises.
Correct.
It must assume what it needs to prove. And therefore, there can be no moral fault in agreeing or disagreeing unless you can enter into that assumption and find the mistakes. And Hume found that funny because as a skeptic, he didn't think any philosophy could really hold together. But when Dilthey uses Weltanschauung, he's building a lifeboat for critical philosophy and say, well, we're not talking just about philosophy in the narrow sense. When we do philosophy, we're putting our philosophy and our science and our religion and everything else into our Weltanschauung, our perspective on the world, and that's the most unifying of perspectives you can have. He's trying, but Torrance is trying to say some of the biggest names in philosophy and religion for the last 100 years are making the same point that I want to make here. The religion needs to talk to philosophy, and philosophy needs to talk to religion. And notice science is not even used here yet. He hasn't discovered what's going on over in the sciences, where they are all making the same point.
Yeah. And his point at the bottom of 238, medieval philosophy was distinctively a religious philosophy.
Yeah.
That even with that, we haven't quite got where we need to get. The nature of the philosophy is being shaped by an ideal of religiosity, which goes on to 239, where the idea of original sin is introduced that you pointed out.
Yeah, and that for an Enlightenment philosopher, the doctrine of original sin is an original mistake. It is a fatal error in all philosophy to inject that in there, and all Tom needs to do is then you can't account for evil.
Right.
And if you can't account for evil, are you really doing philosophy at all? Then you can go to Hume and say that Hume, noticing that so many philosophers actually have a very, very naive humanism on which they float everything. And I just was finding in Barth's Protestant Thought in the 19th Century, the first two chapters in that book are a philosophical survey of the 19th century, where he's making many of these points, and those are lectures he was doing in 1936, 1938. I would guess by this time Torrance has read them. It's amazing stuff, but it's all before his discovery of that what he was trying to do here in philosophy and theology, scientists were also trying to do in science, to be able to reestablish the rational roots of scientific inquiry, where they cannot define the fundamentals of science and then build all the science off of that. They have to assume what they need to prove, that the world is rational and our rationality has access to it, and then work with that and question the questions and question the questions. Marty, I did want to say he glosses over medieval philosophy so fast, but much of that is the kind of critique that Protestants in the 19th century were making of Catholic theology, especially after the decree of infallibility and the bodily assumption of Mary and the First Vatican Council. There was a real need to clarify where the Catholic Church went wrong, and it is a theological mistake and a philosophical mistake that it needs to reform, which happily it did. But Bart
takes that on, saying that Catholic theology is built in a two-story library. On the first floor is all of the works of the Greek philosophers, or the second floor is the biblical studies and all that. But you have to go through the first floor to get to the second floor and read scripture. And he saw that as profoundly problematic.
Yes.
because all you're doing is seeing through that lens.
And so he would not, Torrance would not have found a ecumenical theologian in the Karl Barth of 1938, 1939. It would, or anywhere else. Ecumenical then would be Church of Scotland talking to the Church of England, and that's about it.
Uh-huh. So on page 239, the first full paragraph, the belief of the schoolman, the ability of philosophy to subdue apprehension of reality to a consistent whole, meant that they carried over from Greek thought the idea that at bottom man is at one with God. That is, they posited a doctrine of continuity in the human consciousness to God, so tended in this underlying monism to take up into their Christian attitude another religious attitude and a corresponding interpretation of the world. So the interpretation of the world there, interpreting the universe, John McMurray, and McMurray introduces the distinctives of Greek thought as this consciousness in the mind. So once again, I would chalk this up to another McMurray allusion without footnote.
Not sure, because the authority he does point to is Kierkegaard.
But the point that he's making here is just one that McMurray makes. And so anyway, I could be wrong, but it just happens to be a point that McMurray makes.
It's common coin in British philosophical and theological cultures. We don't have the Hibbert Journal, and we may find essay after essay after essay on all of these things in previous volumes and subsequent volumes of that journal. So that it's just to try to contextualize this particular essay in Tom's philosophical and theological development. I don't know if how well he has read Murray yet.
McMurray.
And
we know that he's read him well enough that he's quoting from some of his significant text, Reason and Emotion, and Interpreting the Universe, and the Clue to History. I mean, so there is quite good evidence, I think, so that he was reading those. You're right, they might have come from elsewhere, but we know he's quoting McMurray, and so to not recognize that there is some inclination that these thoughts are coming from there, I think it should not be taken off the table.
No, didn't say that.
Yeah, good. So, and again, McMurray did write an introduction. I can't remember if it's a biography or a work of Kant's, but McMurray was also a Kant scholar as well. So again, to say even those connections are something to be pursued that I have not fully pursued all that. But that's another book on my shelf with a McMurray introduction to a work on Kant. So anyway, the threads, obviously, we have a fabric, we have a network of things here with interconnections and borrowing, and to just recognize, at least in the initial section, Torrance wants to say philosophy goes in a wrong direction when it stays within the human mind and doesn't engage reality. If we get that point, I think we're getting what he wants us to get, so that when we go to the problem of unity and coherence, he begins with Schelling, who declared either real evil is admitted and the possibility of final coherence given up, or the reality of evil must be some way denied. And so he begins with a philosophical problem around the nature of evil, as you've noted here, Ken.
No.
He engages the Platonic doctrine of evil on about the 8th line down.
Yeah.
And then both of these presuppositions are impossible for modern philosophy. He refuses to accept medieval worldview and insists on a critical philosophy, and also realizes far more than ancient or medieval philosophy, the third character of evil. Somehow evil posits itself and cannot be rationalized. It is the Hebraic Christian teaching which has opened our eyes to this fact. Now, you can deny me again here if you want, but I'm just going, where is he getting a caricature of the Hebrew Christian, and I'll throw the word apperception in here, as a way forward? And I just want to suggest that's the clue to history, John McMurray.
But how about H.R. Mackintosh?
I haven't read enough of Mackintosh to know exactly the language that Mackintosh uses, and the two of them may have been in concert, but I'm just saying this there. He's developing the thoughts, the critique of the Greek thought on the terms that McMurray does, the way forward with the Hebraic Christian thought, the way McMurray does. And then he's going to ultimately, give us in a few pages the character of scientific thinking that Torrance is going to build. And I'm just saying there's a lot of dots here to not connect at some point.
Well,
And say something seems like it's going on.
Just trying
So
to lay
anyway,
out a chronology, just a chronology. When do these things happen?
Yep. So all of the works of McMurray were present for him to have been able to read them and have these in his mind at this point. So as we're looking then at the problem of unity and coherence, there's a sense of a world within which we're beginning to think with Christian faith, but it's not Christian faith that's just grounded in the head. It has some dimension of the actual unity, which a Christian view of a God who creates, and that evil is a world that is laid out for us in a Christian understanding seen through Scripture. So there's a coherence that is brought in that gives a unified world that I think he's going to see indebted to a Christian worldview. And so the unity of that Christian worldview gives us a view of faith that we can begin to build on. So on 241, at the last paragraph, without doubt, one of the most powerful urges with the human minds are endowed is the urge to unify all thought. It is a right urge. This tragedy is that under the power of that urge, facts are almost inevitably forced into an abortive unity, which in the Christian view is the very essence of sin. So once the mind goes away from the truth of God revealed in the person of Jesus and a view that is God is the creator, think divine and contingent reality, when you leave that, you're forcing things into a unity that are no longer connected to actual reality. So the nature of the reality that Torrance wants is a Christian formed view of the world with a creator who creates a world contingent on that creator and understood within the context of that creative work. And so the last paragraph, or the last sentence, faith does not ask the philosopher as such to adopt a Christian attitude in his philosophy or to turn it into a new dogmatic philosophy, but faith does ask philosophy to be truly critical and undogmatic. And faith believes that it is possible only in a situation where a man is brought to stand upon his naturalistic presuppositions and to view them from another standpoint. So there's a moving out of the head and willing to look critically and ask the questions. Questioning the questions, I think, is implicit in what he would call a Christian understanding. We're going to start just asking bigger, better, deeper questions as Christians.
Tom had another favorite phrase along with question your questions is do not surd the absurd.
And the word surd there means what? How do you define the word surd within that statement?
Bryden, do you have a quick definition? Because with my COVID fever, I'm having difficulty coming up with stuff. We still use the word absurd.
Yes. So what's absurd?
Yeah, but and it's what is your dictionary definition of absurd?
Well, it isn't mine so much as I was with Nigel Bigger on Wednesday evening and his book on colonialism, and he got cancelled twice over things. Anyway, they talk about insanity. They talked about madness. I mean, in one sense, Douglas Murray comes into the party here with his madness of crowds. So absurd for me is almost a sanity, whereas the absurd is an insanity. That's the best I can do on the fly.
It was in his usage, he was saying, do not force things that are basically absurd into the cramped, what do you call it, an abortive package.
Unity.
Unity. It's a fake unity. Where is this happen a lot? usually in people heavily influenced by Augustine. Even though Augustine himself, I don't think, can be accused of this, but certainly with Schleiermacher, who loved Plato. There was always the question of, had he asserted the absurd in order to get evil or the redemption from evil into his system in a reputable way. So whenever I see people struggling with the problem of evil, there's two things. One is, as you said, Marty, fight or flight. When they flee from it and run away, nothing happens. But when they fight and struggle and try to come to terms with evil and the God of love, and they end up asserting an absurd, the answer becomes very fragile and begins to fall apart. What struck me when I was reading this essay is, even back here in Beech Grove, that's already axiomatic for Top, that evil is a way of testing any philosophical or theological proposition. If the proposition asserts the absurd, it's false. Reject.
Can I toss again Jungel into the story?
Bill had his hand up there. I want to get him in here.
Sorry, Bill, go for it.
Oh, Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms, a heavy duty. Yeah, absurd, evil. And have you ever heard of a philosopher named Edgar Sheffield Brightman? It's a term, according to him, I kind of like this, for the kind of evil that has no possibility of being used for a good purpose, no matter what occurs around it. So I guess there are types of evil that can be used for a good purpose, depending.
It's usually a defense of war.
Absurd is absolutely void of any possibility of good, no matter what happens around it. It's interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's evil used in politics, but this is not that, because it gets used for all kinds of things. So.
No. I was going to say that Jungel has this extraordinary use of Hegel's speculative Good Friday, which he wants to kick into the trash can, but then he wants to say, well, what about the real space-time Good Friday? What does that do to the undertow of das Nichtige, the nothingness, the undertow of evil? I mean, he faces it head on. And I think that, for me, is one of the gifts that Jung brings us. He brings us a few. He also leaves a few problems, I think, but that's another story for another day. I think by facing evil head on through the cross, through Holy Saturday, I think von Balthasar is doing something very profound there. Through to Easter Day, then the Ascension, we only have a dramatic presentation of the solution, in inverted commas, to evil, which is no solution. It doesn't answer the question. It deals with the problem. And I think that is two very different things here. It's back to this action business, Marty. It doesn't actually debate the question. It deals with the question. And I think there's a very, very important distinction to be made. It deals with the question. Oh, man. I mean, pastorally, sorry. You're a counselor with families and all the rest of it. Yeah. I mean, for goodness sake, you got to deal with the question. Back to my friend Sue. Nobody dealt with her MS. She died of MS and its complications. But actually, MS was dealt with. Beautiful, beautiful distinctions that we're having to draw here, thanks to the Christian revelation. Anyway, there you go.
Yeah. So just to conclude on the problem of unity and coherence, false unity,
of course,
philosophies, and trying to fit evil coherently, inappropriately, will leave you confused and with the absurd. And then moving on then to the problem of objectivity and analogy, once again, he's going to go back to the Greeks here again with what is sometimes called the autonomous reason. This conception of reason as a law unto itself is mainly modern, though its roots go back to Greek philosophy. Again, this is almost quoting McMurray word for word. Certainly, ancient thought was much more realist and extrovert than we modern people, but apt to imagine implying a view of reason as already bound up with and depend upon an objective world. But the first steps toward the autocracy of reason, as the Greek preferred to call it, were taken notably by Anaxagoras, Protagoras, and Gorgias, these Greek philosophers. The fundamental issue was most clearly focused by Platonic Socrates. The problem he saw was this: a man cannot inquire either about what he knows or about what he does not know. What he knows, and therefore he does not need to inquire about it. Neither can he inquire about what he does not know, for he does not even know for what to inquire. And so there is the mind caught up within itself and not able at some level to engage reality objectively. And so there is a problem of what he calls in the next sentence the self-dependence of reason. So that it's reason dependent upon the self, not able to be fully objective in the world. So he goes on, talking about self-consciousness and the problem of the autonomy of reason separated from reality. All of this is a lack of objectivity and the internal turn at some level that becomes problematic, where the very nature of reality is simply what's reflected in thoughts, categories of understanding, and a charmed circle of autonomous activity is a phrase that he uses there. That's quite a phrase. So it's the internal logic that it can't really escape out into the world, and therefore can't do the work of what Torrance is going to call a proper kind of faith. So it's on page 243 that he engages with Kierkegaard in the top paragraph, and then he's going to go on in the second paragraph to McMurray. So what is the point that he makes with Kierkegaard? Therefore, as a rule, when the autonomous reason comes across the unknown, it subdues the unknown to the forms of its own understanding, puts it in a corral kind of, and the unknown is translated into terms of what is already known. So you just can't get anything new. It cannot conceive an absolute unlikeness except in terms of itself, for it allows no breach in the circle of its own autonomy. And he put parenthesis there, Kierkegaard. So can somebody make the link between what Kierkegaard's saying as a critique to this internal corral in the mind?
Hi, darling.
Are you talking to me? So my sense is that Kierkegaard, in his quote unquote subjectivity, is that as a subject, we know the world other than ourselves. And what people think of as subjectivity as merely being locked in oneself in Kierkegaard is actually the opposite. The leap of faith is actually the engagement with the other. It's that dynamic movement to the other where we as subjects engage in actual engagement, that which was previously unknown. And so in philosophical fragments, to talk about the meeting of the other, which he almost has a Christ moment in that sense, and that one cannot merely look to educate, which means to lead out that which is within oneself, but one has to actually be transformed by the encounter with the other. And so I think that's the point that Torrance is making here, is that Kierkegaard gives us a key out of the dungeon of our mind to engage what was previously unknown. Then in the next paragraph, there's the happily. I love these little happily things. Torrance is happy. Later philosophy is reaching a much saner view of reason. It has been due partly to thought initiated by Delphi, who saw that the historical philosophers have always broken down into antinomies and relativity, and due partly to Kierkegaard's critique of Socrates that was in Philosophical Fragments. Today, philosophy is engaged in making the step from what Ernst Cassirer has called, and again, you got some big words there. Philosophy is coming to see that reason is not something substantival, but verbal, not so much a state as an act. The word act there again is McMurray in spades, and therefore to be functionally interpreted, how we engage reality. The element of will or action left out of reason in the Aristotelian tradition is returning as one sees, for example, in the philosophy of John McMurray. So that, and again, he's quoting without putting a footnote to it, but it's from Reason and Emotion, so that reason is described as the capacity to behave consciously in terms of the nature of the object. Reason is our capacity for objectivity. And this line gets picked up by lots of people who quote Torrance here and not McMurray, unfortunately. So people lose McMurray there. And again, I think it's important. This is the point at which we can begin to understand Christian faith. Well, what's he saying? He's saying that reason itself is based on engagement with the reality of the other, particularly all that is given in the Christian faith. It provides the coherence, it provides the unity, it provides engagement with reality. Everything that we need, McMurray's key for us here gives us the methodology of an appropriate epistemology so that we're engaging in reality. And even McMurray himself is going to say it isn't the person of Christ, because the clue to history is what? It's the person of Christ. And that's the book that I'm suggesting is his 3, the Greek, Hebrew, Roman, comes from. So if Christ is the clue to history, then we have a new opportunity. Faith is the capacity of reason to behave in terms of a unique object who is subject. It is of the nature of God always to be subject. When therefore reason, thus understood, behaves in terms of the nature of this object, the person of Christ, reason takes on itself the nature of subjectivity or personality, which again is, it's an early term. McMurray used personality. He moved on to person and distinguished personality as that which would be the development of the individual in their own particularity, whereas person is who we are in our relationality. So McMurray uses those to identify there is that sense of knowing my own thoughts, but they are even shaped by who I am in relation with other persons. I am formed in relation, and for McMurray, the mother-child is the initiating point in our human development where that process takes place. And I have a chapter in the book, Child Theology, on John McMurray's development of an understanding of theology from his mother-child relationship. I see that hand, Bill.
Yeah, just quickly, that quote of McMurray that in your essay you call astonishing, which is at the end of the introduction to a Christian frame of mind. And Nehart says of Torrance's life and thought in a unity grounded in the realization that, quote, and here's McMurray, quote, all meaningful knowledge is for the sake of action, and all meaningful action for the sake of friendship.
Friendship, yes. That's from the introduction to Self as Agent.
It's where?
It's in the introduction to the Self as Agent, the first of his 2 volumes of the Gifford Lectures.
Ah, so because it was not cited as to where.
That's, yes. So it's from the introduction to the Self as Agent. 1954, I believe, would have been the date of that. Yeah.
Wait, what was that? Hold it back a little bit.
There you go. The Self as Agent.
The Self as Agent. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
The 2 books together are called The Form of the Personal. The first one is The Self as Agent, where he critiques the nature of philosophy that had gone internalized. Volume 2, Persons in Relation, he says, but that's not actually who we are. We are actually persons in relationship. And chapter 2 in that book is the mother-child relationship that he develops into a whole understanding of the relational sense of our being, and that the relation of ourself to the world, naming just milk versus water, naming mother versus father, is the discrimination of the other. The language of this is this and that is where reason comes from, but it's emotionally developed as someone helps us to relate to the world and names it. So reason is just developed emotion that has discriminated all these things so we know how to relate to them.
Ultimately reflecting the triune God's interrelational character. a unitary community of love.
Yep.
I think myself that it's quite helpful to actually not try and prioritize emotion and reason, because if Augustine is right, and that's a big if, in his psychological analogy, knowledge, understanding, love, and will are absolutely integral to true personhood, true subjectivity. And I think there's no competition here. So, in one sense, McMurray is right because of the child developmental stuff. But on the other hand, goodness knows what's going on inside that wonderfully plastic little set of neurons called a brain, aged 12 months. I mean, whoa, you know? I mean, I watch it in our grandchildren and I'm just flabbergasted in a way that I could never be as a parent.
Yeah. And McMurray is mostly trying to critique the idea that reason is really the dominant human thing we need to depend upon, and emotion is not trustworthy, and say, whoa, just a minute here. You can't separate them, for one, and you can't make the priority of one over the other because they are irreducibly bound together. And they're bound together with the act of the person as well. So that also has to be included within that as well. And so
which
the
is
acts
actually,
of God, on the day of Pentecost, everyone heard in their own language the mighty acts of God. It's not saying that we throw out the reasoning of God or the love of God. It's actually all those are revealed in hearing the mighty acts of God. So there's a unitary sense that is even part of that language.
thank you. No, that's enough. Yeah.
Yeah, good. So at this point then in the article, Torrance is now introducing us to the way forward. And it's faith based upon an engagement with the other, where one acts and understands reflectively because we understand what we are engaging, and we develop reason because we have this capacity for seeing that something or someone is other than ourselves and to learn from it. Right. And so he, I think, did learn this from geology. McMurray learned it from geology. And so the nature of what then becomes a kind of science that Polanyi is going to be representative of, with indwelling the other, where one doesn't merely observe the phenomenon, which is a philosophical position, not just the phenomenon of what's going on, but the story of what's going on, the layers, the strata of all that's going on, and to really be able to engage all of it is part of this investigative work. So the direction of the article at this point then is going to still have somewhat of a critiquing, but he's going to critique in light of having now a position that is a positive position to build on, to distinguish, for example, at the top of 244, after the quote, this is the sin of idealism, for which the Christian faith must be regarded as the sin of philosophical sin. So now that we have the truth of Christian engagement with the real God known in Jesus, now we can see that any idealism around Christianity is just going to end up making an idol that isn't actually God. And so the nature here, he's quoting from Buber in the quote at top of 244, man desires to possess God. And so I think in that you've already got a critique that's there, that Buber's saying that's the human trying to possess God, and probably not God. He desires a continuity in space and time of possession of God. He is not content with the inexpressible confirmation of meaning, but he wants to see this confirmation stretched out as something that can be continually taken up, handled, a continuum of unbroken in space and time that ensures his life at every point and every moment. He longs for extension in time, for duration. Thus, God becomes an object, and see the word idol there, an idol of faith. And so there's Buber creating an image of false gods based on the human kind of philosophy that makes gods up in one's mind, even stretching for the God that one wants. And you can think Schleiermacher here, the human sense of dependence on the other. Feuerbach, that we make God, it's just a projection of the human. Its theology is anthropology. All of it is just that problem that is being addressed here by philosophers who are giving us eyes to see that it's all bad theology and it's ultimately bad philosophy as well. in the paragraph that begins with the number one, reason finds that in order to be rational, to behave in terms of the object, it must suspend its unity complex, in other words, putting things in a box, for it confronts a unique object to which there is no analogy, which will not be schematized. It is the huge boulder of a thou blocking the path, which cannot honestly be subdued to an it. We can't, it is putting it in the box. Your thing, we've got a name for it, label that one, put it in the drawer. We know what that is, right? And so the nature of, again, the I, thou, I, it, that's Buber language at some level, is just recognizing the problem of human thinking about God that tries to do something with God that's inappropriate to the nature of God, reducing God to an object that can be managed, controlled, labeled. And Torrance is saying God has just become an it then, is no longer the God of the Christian faith. And your reason has just got you back in your head and not dealing actually with what's going on. So further down, he's going to talk about the monologue and the dialogue. So reason ends up just being a conversation in one's own head with oneself. That's a monologue. And what he's saying needs to be there in the nature of faith is a dialogue. The dialogue of faith is an engagement with the subject, who is God, or maybe the subject of the world as it speaks to us in other persons, where there's a real engagement with the objectivity of the other as real, present, and we become open to it in a dialogue where learning becomes possible. And hence, he doesn't use the word here, but true science. We're actually gaining knowledge that we didn't know. And so to say faith is science that's open to the other. Faith is seeking understanding because it's objectively open to learn from the other. And in the first instance with God, but also then with the whole rest of the world. In his second point then, in faith, a man realizes he does not possess the truth in himself and cannot autonomously give it to himself. In fact, just because he can only receive it from outside himself, and in the act of receiving, it must reorient the natural configuration of his reason, gained in behaving in terms of the material world. Faith gives man, faith seeking understanding, we could say there, gives man to know that he is actually in the wrong end and needs to be put right with the capital T truth, person of Jesus, I think maybe implied there. Maybe it's just all of true reality before we can know. That is why the New Testament thinks of faith always in terms of metanoia, the change of mind. And as Alan Torrance said, it should be, we are metanoid. Our mind is changed because reality comes to us, not that we went looking for it. So maybe that might be your receptivity thing that you're talking about, Bryden. The receptivity of what is reality changes us. And so metanoia happens at that point. So to say, as the prodigal son came home with a story in his head, monologue, he met the father with open arms, and in that embrace was metanoia, as he discovered his father was not going to be confused with his tales to be told, but that the determination of who the father was going to be transformative of the son who was lost, who was dead, and now he's alive. Call everybody, call the friends, the family. We're going to kill the fatted calf and celebrate because the one who was dead, object, now is home, subject, embraced, loved, because of who the father is. Metanoia, transformation of relationship, transformation of person. Even the prodigal son was transformed when he discovered that he was seen not for what he thought he was as a failure, but one beloved.
I see the whole of Luke 15 as the parable of the seeking farmer, the seeking woman, and the prodigal father.
Yes.
I mean, for me, those are the titles of the three parables, climaxing in,
that's exactly what I said.
Yeah, it is.
I use those. That's exactly the point.
It is.
Prodigal, if it means extravagance, the father, everyone who seeks for what is lost is extravagant in their commitment to find the lost and to bring it home. That's the extravagance of the word prodigal, appropriately named.
Yeah, thank you. No, I agree.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. So the very bottom of the page then, um, change of mind and justification, we need to be put right. Science is the putting right of our mind with actuality. In the same way that our being put right with God is a transformation of our being aligned with reality instead of otherwise, being put in the right with God or the truth. In other words, faith discovers to a man that far from having the conviction of truth in himself, as the philosophers think, like Socrates, in his naturalistic state, a man is at enmity with the truth and needs to be reconciled to it. And in fact, needs to be altered in the very cast of his mind as so as to be born again or converted. That's the continuing work of good science, good faith, and philosophy when it's doing the right thing. Bill, I saw that hand. You're on mute.
I was waving bye-bye to Ken. Sorry.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah, Ken put in the chat, said
Oh, I
so
see.
long. I'm
I was
sorry.
so enthused with what I was reading that I missed that part.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're almost done here, so I'll just say that the whole nature going on here, the challenge of what Nietzsche calls the will to power, that's the human seeking its own thing. In the end, the very nature of being transformed by reality for Torrance is going to be what it is that faith and an appropriate philosophy do. The will to be transformed by reality is this openness, and the nature of Kierkegaard, I think, is one who he thinks leads us in that direction, so that his final sentence, philosophy is an academic science or discipline which seeks not to be dogmatic, but critical and impartial, like Bryden, cannot really succeed in being critical and impartial until by faith, it is made to realize that by nature man is already committed to a basic worldview, which is the worldview of God, which he cannot suspend of himself, and which will inevitably dominate his thinking and spoil his philosophy by betraying it into foregone conclusions. There is no such thing as pure neutrality. Either a man is committed to a basic worldview in Christ that is naturalistic, or he takes a decisive stand against that in faith. It is the claim of this essay that only the man of faith can be a true philosopher, because he is in a position to suspend the direction of his previous worldview upon his metaphysics, and can also philosophize without the dogmatism of faith, because he understands his faith as seeking understanding, and hence understands himself. A true openness in science and philosophy and faith is opened up then as his final statement. So, whew, we made it through there. Do we understand it any better than we did when we started it?
Actually, yes.
Good. That is the hopeful thing that will happen, is that we'll get done and say there's still lots to learn, but I think we're understanding where he came from and where he's going. And I think he never loses these critiques. They're always
Well,
in the back of his mind, and you just hear them in different nuanced ways. But I think there's the seed of much in this essay that he is just going to keep developing. And so to be able to get this is important for being able to go on and see and hear and understand other things later. So, including in theological science.
part of that seed is yielding the growth of John McMurray and the as an influencer in
Yeah, well, for me,
Torrance's book,
McMurray he has other
larger and
tools
larger.
that will become useful that Torrance doesn't even use. So to get to know McMurray and what he's using allows you further
Yeah.
ripples in the pond, so to speak, that are also helpful.
Well,
I
it'd be
think too.
interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm intrigued by the fact that, to use that metaphor again, we're getting the building blocks.
Yes.
We're getting the building blocks of what makes Torrance Torrance, and that's no mean thing, because we can then actually replicate those building blocks in our own way relative
Yep.
to the context we find, etc., etc., etc.
Yep. Yep.
Well,
I
you
wish
know
that
that
he had footnoted more, but I think this is an article that does give us basic building blocks.
That's
Bill.
what McGrath said he was looking for in his book, The Building Blocks. And he also, he mentions that in that lecture he gives to the
Yes.
Yes. So.
Incredible to revisit that lecture. Hey, Bill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Plus, there's, I have a video. You can find a video, I think, on GCI, plus a transcript.
With McGrath.
Or audio, plus an audio. You have transcript. Yeah. So it's very interesting.
Very good. Well, I appreciate the conversation and for you guys being here today. And I think many will benefit from being able to reflect on our reflections and engage reality and hopefully helpful ways.
Oh, hi.
Even Tim in faraway Ireland.
Hi,
Very good.
Marty.
Hello, Tim.
Hello. I got in there
Sláinte.
at the end.
We're on both sides of the world. We've got New Zealand and Scotland. There's something connected there with those particular islands, those particular far sides of places, but with connections. I guess it's more Scotland with Dunedin, but anyway.
Isaiah speaks about the islands, the far-flung islands.
The far-flung
Sean
islands.
Suggath. He's
Okay,
gone.
well, I will sign off next week.
Yep.
I think we have another, let's see, who do we have next week? We have Jerome Van Kijken with Chapter 2, The Interaction of Theology with Scientific Development, Change in the Doctrine of God. So that is something to look forward to for next week.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you,
Blessings on
Marty.
you, friends.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.